Welcome to the Trauma-Informed Lens podcast, where we explore how trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in the podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional. Hello, and welcome to episode 4 of the Trauma-Informed Lens podcast. Today we're going to talk about a topic very closely related to episode 3 when we introduced the concept of homeostasis. And as I look at, so if you haven't listened to episode 3, you may want to go back and peek. I think all of us would agree that homeostasis is one of the critical aspects of all of our learning journeys around trauma. And so again, if you haven't listened to episode 3, you might want to go peek back into that one. We will try to catch up a little bit so nobody's lost, but getting into really another key topic, and I think a real fascinating topic this week with epigenetics. And so before we start, every week we go through our bright, shiny objects of the week, something that is fascinating us, dominating our thinking, or just kind of pulling our attention towards it. And since I got the mic to start out with, I will throw mine out there. And for me, it's what's really going on, not kind of a positive one per se, but just my worry about what's going on in Puerto Rico. I was lucky enough a few years back to go out there and do some training on the island, and it was kind of, they changed the day of the training, and all my friends and I had scheduled a vacation out there. So I was unfortunate enough to have to go to Puerto Rico twice in one month of January a few years back, and I just love the people. I think you guys might have had this experience too. When you go and spend a few days training folks in our field, I was out there working with public health folks and HIV health providers. You just get to know a place in a different way. I felt the same way about Houston, and you really make friends and get to know people and get to know the community. I was in San Juan, but was working with people from all over the island. So I know I speak for all of us when, you know, as people who think and talk about trauma, when you see something like this playing out and people losing their homes, and a lot of people, it seems like right now, are wondering, are they going to survive this thing? And so just to send my love and our love out to them, and a beautiful island that I know will come back strong. But just watching my friends I know go through a lot of stuff out there. So just sending my thoughts today out there from Colorado, and I know I do that for all of us as well. Curt, you want to talk about your bright, shiny object of the week?
You bet. You know, you guys know I recently started the new job. I'm about a month into it now. And so thinking about bright, shiny objects, I thought the position that I'm in right now is I'm trying to not have too many bright, shiny objects. Things that are drawing my attention in too many directions. So that's kind of also something that I've been working on this week. And what's come to my attention this week is certainly the impact of team functioning on both organizational performance and on how well people get better and how well people can heal. And I was watching it, actually, I was thinking about it and watching I think it was a YouTube broadcast about Saturday Night Live and why Saturday Night Live works so well. And this perspective was pretty interesting. I hadn't heard it before, in that from the inside perspective that this person was sharing, it was that Lorne Michaels is the one who makes it work. He can put all of these comedians together who are used to being lone wolves and doing their own thing, and he takes care of them. And their team meeting structures are really pretty interesting in that if somebody hasn't talked for very long, he stops the meeting and asks them, what are they thinking? I thought, what a great leader that is. What a great example of being a leader. Or if somebody really just can't participate, he'll stop the meeting and take them outside and be like, how can I help you? Like, what's going on there? How do I get you to participate in this team? And that when the team functions that way, you get something really, really creative and really cool, like Saturday Night Live. It is really entertaining. It's probably one of the longest running television shows in history.
Yeah.
And so I've been thinking about that a lot with a lot of the both organizational and clinical tasks that I've been asked to do in the last month, and seeing how well teams function and what I can do to help those teams to function better. And that's certainly is my bright, shiny object of the week that's got my attention.
Very cool. I saw something, I believe it was the same thing, but Google had done a study recently about their high-performing teams. And the number one thing, which is something we talk a lot about in our field, in our profession of psychology, social work, public health, really the number one predictor that they saw was psychological safety. And I believe they use Saturday Night Live. I read a few business books here and there too. And using that as an example is, what Michaels does so well is creates a safe place in something where they're shooting a lot of stuff back and forth, and he's got to cut certain, I mean, not everybody's ideas make it into the show, and sometimes you work a lot on the ideas and it doesn't get in the show. And they use that as an example of creating psychological safety, not in a residential care setting or a classroom, but for a comedy show. And again, one of the predictors of why it plays out so good.
Yeah. One thing I was thinking as well this week is I'm working on what should I train first? Like, where should I go with teaching first? And one of the questions that comes to my mind in making that decision is, do you teach about evidence-based practices first, or do you teach about leadership first?
Yeah.
And I decided to teach leadership first. And I was talking to some of my coworkers about it, about why I made that decision. And program design is, I think it should be tied to what works. And if we go through some scientific rigor to decide what works, I think that should be a good thing to base our program design upon. But on the other hand, no amount of evidence base can overcome the impact of a poorly functioning team as its effect on an intervention. And so that's why I decided to go with teaching team functioning first, and then we can go to learning about the evidence-based practices, and the team functioning will make them work. It will make them successful. So that's certainly on my mind a lot this week.
Very cool. Thanks for sharing that. Jerry, what do you got for us this week?
Well, Curt, that sounds like a whole nother presentation. We could do it. I'm going to piggyback on what you said, Matt. And what I've been kind of interested in is the concepts of, or the experience of attention span. Mm-hmm. And that we went from Houston to Florida to Puerto Rico to Mexico City, and how really having to digest multiple really traumatic events.
Yeah.
And yet we move on, and we don't necessarily, because of the way the media covers it, really get to see this recovery process. And everyone gets left with this traumatic, overwhelming anxiety and fear and in some ways suffering, but really doesn't allow us the process to see the incredible capacity of people to recover from those experiences. And so, I think that, hopefully from our presentations, we kind of balance out this capacity for people to be both traumatized, but the incredible ability to be resilient and change and grow. And I think your points about teaching effective interventions is about really maximizing our natural ability to heal and recover from traumatic events. And when there is adequate, both internal but external kind of supports and resources around, people can maximize the interventions that we can provide. So that's really what I've been kind of thinking about. What's the cumulative impact of watching all these events on people in the general population? Absolutely.
Yeah, and you're hearing a lot of people, and I've had people talk to me about this as well as trainings, is there seems to be, and you actually hear this playing out on the news a little bit, is the people in these environments understand that there's kind of this 3-week window at most, where they're going to, I'm trying to think about the last time I saw Houston make the news, or even what happened in Florida, or the Miami, or what happened in Mexico. And, so you even hear this to say, hey, we got 3 weeks. Please keep covering us. Come back here. Don't forget about us. So I think that's kind of worked itself into the mainstream. And I think it's important for all of us to remember these folks, that the struggles are going to be happening for years. As you look at it, it looks like somebody just dropped a bomb, whether it's the Virgin Islands or Puerto Rico or what happened in Mexico City, just horrific stuff. And the fallout of trauma, I think it's also a good reminder, is trauma happens, but trauma doesn't just stop after the event's over. That, some people can be carrying these psychological scars and physical scars with them well into the future as well. So, I mean, this is just years sometimes of recovery. And I think that's a great lead in. I mean, as you were saying that too, when we talked about homeostasis last week, we talked about it from a couple different angles, where I sort of presented a model of my thinking of how it's our brain sort of adapting to our environment, and versus, I think Curt and Jerry had, and how when our environment changes, it elicits that stress response that we have, and that over time we can adapt to our environment. But when we get thrust into a different environment, that can cause stress, and if it's a big enough shift or a stressful enough shift, can cause trauma. And I just, again, when you were saying that, Jerry, just bringing up some of those pictures of watching those people in front of their houses that are totally destroyed, is now your environment has shifted so dramatically. I want to email and call some folks I know in Puerto Rico, but I don't want to waste their electricity because I know it's so rare right now. And so waking up one day and your environment went from a pretty maybe safe and stable environment to one that's, a disaster zone, and how that elicits trauma. And that really leads us into how are we so adaptive as a human species? Is that most of the people, even though their lives went from fairly safe and normal one day to traumatic in a lot of ways, and wondering, where are we going to get some of our basic needs met? Are we going to survive? Is my community going to be able to bounce back? Over time, we know we can adapt and survive. Again, there can be long-term wounds that we carry with us at times, and healing is an important process to that. But when I think about homeostasis and how we adapt, whether it's short-term, long-term, to environmental changes, epigenetics is a science that, as a self-proclaimed nerd and proud of that label, it really helped me understand the impact of environment and relationships on things like behavior, on mental health, and how our brain develops over time to adjust to the environments that we're in. And one of my learning, not to get too nerdy here, but I think that's a little bit of the science really helped me understand this, is when I was in school, taking a chemistry or biology class, which has been decades now, unfortunately, I can say those words, since I've had a biology class, but we talked about our DNA as something that accounted for our hair color or eye color, or the fact that I'm freakishly tall. That our DNA really hit those physical characteristics, and we can even take a step in some of our personality traits. And so we had this idea of DNA being recessive or dominant, and we got these chromosomes from mom, these chromosomes from dad, and they came together to create kind of our physical and in some ways our personality characteristics, depending on the theory that we had. We had that nature versus nurture argument that, again, back in the dark ages of psychology that I got trained in the late 90s, we were still having that argument. And then what I learned about in the last few years is that we used to have, and I don't even remember being taught these, but the DNA that I was taught, that what was called chromosomal DNA, the hair color, the eye color, chromosomal DNA only made up 2% of our overall DNA. And the other 98% was what we labeled junk DNA, which I just think is fascinating. When we don't understand something, we'll label it junk. So here's this junk DNA that makes up the vast majority of our DNA structure. And then what they found recently as our technology got better, they now call this non-coded DNA. And so this DNA, when we talk, and you'll probably hear me and probably all of us say this to some extent, talk about genetic expression, is that my eye color is unlikely to change dramatically throughout my lifespan. Chromosomal DNA is fairly, even though there is some differentiation, fairly consistent throughout our life. This 98% of our non-coded DNA, what's the majority of our DNA, can express itself differently over time. So when we talk about whether we're adapting to a traumatic environment or whether we're being raised in a safe, stable, healthy home, what happens is basically there's a communication between the environmental needs and that non-coded DNA. And that non-coded DNA will express itself, which, if you want to get nerdy about it, it releases a protein called RNA. And eventually that can lead to structures, how our brain is structured, and then those are our personality traits and other things. And so if you think about us as human beings, and we know this happens, can happen in a more rapid way in childhood, but it happens throughout our life, is that at our DNA level, this microscopic level, we're always adapting to our environment and creating, is when we think about homeostasis and epigenetics, we're creating the brain, as I like to say, to best survive and thrive in that environment. So this whole nature versus nurture argument that again, I spent way too much time talking about in undergrad and grad school, what we know is that it's kind of a little bit of both. Is the best conclusion that I can come to with this research is that there is some genetic stuff that accounts for some of our traits. Again, why I'm freakishly tall, this, that, and the other. But there's also a huge piece of the nurtured part. And I know, and Jerry, I'm treading on your territory too. You know, early on in child development, you know, the genetics might play a bigger role, and then the environment kicks in, you know, as well. And so if everything goes well, as I look at it, and Jerry, I'm going to encourage you guys can get a little bit more detailed in this, is that if the pregnancy goes well, which isn't always the case, as we know with a lot of folks we work with, and they're born well, it's almost, you know, into infancy that there's this brain just packed with not unlimited potential, but pretty damn close to unlimited potential. And then the environment kicks in where we get to pruning and all those other stuff where we really create the person we are, in many ways as a response to the environment. So then you throw trauma in there, and again, our genetics are going to respond to that in a very real way as well. So I'm going to shut up, throw it over. Jerry, let me throw it to you to see your thoughts. I know you've got that childhood development piece down pretty well and talked a lot about that too.
Yeah, I was wondering, you just look like you're thinking that, Curt, so I was wondering what was going through that mind of yours.
Thinking back to a graduate course that I had in behavior analysis. And it reminds me of a question about how do you, at any given moment in time, explain what an organism is doing? What's the information that you need? And the answer in this course was essentially you need to understand that individual organism's genetic endowment. You need to understand that organism's learning history, and you need to understand the current environment. And I think that that's still a pretty good answer, in understanding all of those things. And I certainly think that each one of those, I don't know that you could put a differential importance level on any one of those three different areas of knowledge. So I was thinking that while Matt was talking, that was kind of reverberating in my brain, and kind of holding the behavioral perspective in this group was thinking about making sure that we can keep our attention on what's going on in the current environment as an explanation to things, as much as genetic endowment, which I think is so awesome that we can start to understand that, and also to honor how complicated that is.
Yeah, And that's, I think if anything about this is I tell people I train, nothing about what I say will make your job seem like, oh, this is a lot easier than I thought it was. Because just what you said, Curt, do we ever fully get, we can do hours of assessment, and do we get all the information we really need? And then do our systems have enough flexibility to customize around those needs if we are to even to get a good snapshot, which I don't think historically we've asked people to adjust to our programming more than saying, okay, what's this person's unique needs at times too?
Yeah, I think of a discussion I had with a good friend of mine who is a geneticist. And I asked him one day about epigenetics, and he looked at me and he goes, I don't know, maybe you can explain that to me. Really complicated. I mean, the good news, of course, is that it's another example of how adaptive we are.
Yeah.
And what a great thing that we can be that adaptive, that even how our physical structures are expressed can be impacted by environmental inputs, and that we can be that responsive as a species and as organisms to that from generation to generation. So, I mean, it's such an exciting topic and so many things to talk about. It's kind of hard to know which bright, shiny object to talk about.
Well, Jerry's the structured one of the group, so I'm sure. Help us, Jerry, help us.
I think that the complication with the model that you presented, Curt, with epigenetics is we now have to go back to another generation to understand the learning history and the environment that they came in, because we now know that our genes are going to get modified, not just based on our own experience, but on our previous generations of experience. But I think that a couple of things about the DNA, right, is when we as a science want to study something, we take something apart and study it in isolation, and it looks very different when we put it back together and understand it from how it interacts with multiple systems. So when you're talking about this concept of good DNA and that junky DNA, right, way back in the 1940s, they discovered DNA and they took it out of the nucleus and studied it and looked at it and began to come up with a model that, DNA, activates RNA that activates the development of proteins. And so your DNA was really your destiny. Mm-hmm. What happened in your genes was really who you were going to be and why. So how that really influences us, we can look at people and basically say, the reason you're homeless, the reason you're not doing well in school, the reason is you just don't have good a pool of genes, right? And looking at that. And I think this understanding that really epigenetics really began to come out of studying histories of trauma and things like the Holocaust, or the impact of hunger and famines on next generations, is began to really understand that above the DNA, which is epigenetics, above the DNA, we have regulatory proteins that change the expression of the DNA, and those regulatory proteins are influenced by environmental signals. So then what we have is a mechanism to begin to understand how the environment can not only influence our behavior, but influence our biology. Yeah. So, and the expression of that biology. So when we begin to think about that, is we can help in terms of thinking about from a developmental perspective. Not only, I don't know that our genes are more kind of influenced when we are younger, but we're way more dependent on environmental support to influence our development. And so for a developing fetus, inside the womb, they're completely dependent on the biology of the mother. And in some ways, what we know is earlier than that is the sperm of the dad. And all of that, how that influences, so that some of this information gets transmitted biologically, but also later on after, postnatally, is that the environment's ability to help the infant regulate their states are the signals that are going to be sending information about what type of environment that child has to adapt to and live in. And so that gets transmitted into both the structure and function through the process of neuroplasticity, but it also gets changing in terms of the expression of DNA into how the nervous system, how sensitive and reactive the nervous system is going to be to certain environmental signals.
Yeah.
So I think all of this begins to help us understand how, for example, when we think about homeostasis, is why are some people able to become reactive and return back to homeostasis, where some people are more reactive and take a more difficult time finding that level of equilibrium, even changing that level of equilibrium, based on how their bodies have had to adapt to the environments in which not only they've lived in, but my parents have lived in.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think, you bring up so many good points there, and how this, I think in some ways what I see, and you brought this up too, is that we look at someone experiencing homelessness, or the kids struggling academic or behaviorally in school, or somebody who's struggling with an addiction, and the question is kind of what's wrong with this person. And I think that's a really safe thing for an outsider to do, is if I drive by somebody on the street who's panhandling on the corner trying to survive, well, if I can just think, well, there's something wrong with their DNA. They sort of lost that nature piece of the equation. I don't have to take a whole lot of responsibility for that person's condition, because there's something inherently wrong with them. When we see the epigenetics, and again, we're closely related to homeostasis as well, is, boy, does it puts, I think, it calls all of us, at least. I don't know if it puts pressures on everybody. I feel it is, boy, when we don't as a society ensure that kids have at least some level of safety in their life, that communities don't have some sort of level of economic, that the floor can go all the way down to homelessness, and that we don't have the structures higher up to keep people in safe housing. We all pay a pretty big price for that. And this, for me, I think with my advocacy work as well around helping people understand the impact of trauma, it's like people are going to adapt to the environment we're in, and you don't have to look back too far to see the impact of the environment on people's struggles. And as a society, as long as we allow people to exist in homelessness, or kids growing up in families that are really struggling, and we don't have the ability to go in and really help in meaningful ways, a lot of times, the outcome of that often ends up, again, on the streets as adults, struggling with addictions as adults, why our prisons are so overwhelmed. There's policy issues there too, but boy, you just see this, and it's like, let's get in there and create safe environments for people. But, I think this is just revolutionary and challenging so much of our traditional thinking.
Yeah. So when we think about trauma, right, we begin to have some understanding that a stress response is been a very adaptive way for us to allocate resources to respond to demands in the environment. But in order to be effective, it has to have a process for turning on that system and then turning off that system, right? And so what we began to understand is that the chemicals involved in that, adrenaline, the catecholamines that kind of get your heart racing and kind of get our sympathetic nervous system activated. There's a balancing between the release of the adrenaline and the release of cortisol that allows our parasympathetic and our recovery process to happen. So in our biology, we have this balance between something that turns something on and turns something off.
Yeah.
Right? However, what we know is that over 80% of the cells in our body have receptors for cortisol. So cortisol has way more impacts on our body than just a stress response.
Yeah.
You know, it's regulating our cardiovascular system, our metabolism, our immune systems, our cognitions, right? And so the regulation of cortisol in our system is a really important mechanism just for our overall biology. However, what we also know it has changed in the last really 25 years is that we used to, in some ways, equate the level of cortisol in our body with our subjective experience of stress. Right? So if we had high cortisol, we would assume you were really stressed. Or if you had low cortisol, you weren't stressed. Right? But this process of epigenetics is going to, in some ways, our bodies, not just are we adaptive externally, but we're adaptive internally. It changes the receptors, the number of receptors and sensitivity of the receptors to this cortisol in multiple systems. So you can have, in some ways, what Rachel Yehuda talks about is a dissociation between catecholamines and cortisol, which means that you're not necessarily stressed and feeling your heart pumping and doing it, but your body still has high cortisols or low cortisols, right? What changes at the genetic level is the sensitivity and reactivity of the cells to that cortisol. So you mentioned in a session last week or the week before about finding low cortisol levels and how that relates is what we know is there's this alteration in the sensitivity to the receptors, those cortisol receptors on the cell. So you can have low cortisol, but way more reactivity to cortisol. Or you can have extremely high levels in the body, like in depression, but the body is not as reactive to it.
Yeah.
Right? But there's consequences to these different levels of cortisol.
Yeah.
So what we know is it's related to cardiovascular function, metabolism, respiration, all of the things that were identified in the ACEs studies that have long-term negative health impacts can be in some ways now tied back to these mechanisms of epigenetic alterations that we can now years later begin to make sense of that we couldn't make sense of when we found the ACEs studies because we didn't understand the underlying mechanisms.
Yeah.
We now have some way to explain what we had discovered back in the 1990s so that we now, because we've discovered that, now we can have interventions because if negative experiences can alter our brain structure and functioning and the expression of genes, then what type of experiences do we need to provide with enough repetition to get positive changes?
Yeah.
That is what happens in therapy, is that we're not just looking for a change in the way people perceive, but we're actually looking eventually to make some epigenetic changes so that they can begin to be in the world in a different way, especially for very young children whose biology is developing.
Yeah, I think
I want to, like, you're one of the things that have stuck with me every time I talk to you, to be in the skin and outside the skin. And so, man, I just want to put that context before you answer. I'm just thinking about you and the complexity of all of this. So give me your thoughts, my friend.
The first thought that's popping into my head is actually something that Jerry said to me probably 3 years ago. And it was, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I think that's one of the most exciting things about being in this age of information explosion, is that you can challenge your models anytime you want to. There's always more information out there to go. And being able to add another level even to the model I was describing, which is now, that was 15 years ago, of understanding genetic endowment, current environment, and learning history. And now we have another level to go and understand. And that's super exciting. I really enjoyed that. Yeah. And there will be another one, right? We'll go to another one and another one. And I just find that really enjoyable for me. So that's kind of what I was thinking is I love learning more about all of these different levels of understanding. And certainly, I mean, Jerry, your point about we untie things from each other, and that really none of these things happen in isolation. Right. In the behavioral world, right, we still talk about operant conditioning versus respondent conditioning as separate processes. They're both happening simultaneously all the time. Right. The separation between them is what we've done to study them and try and understand the mechanisms, but they never happen that way. They're both going on all the time. And yeah, that's what I was thinking, Matt, while I was listening to that. And it just what a great time to be alive it is to learn about all of this stuff. How much I enjoy it.
Right. And not only are they happening all the time within us, they're happening all the time between us.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. And so now we have a psychology that not only is about what's in my brain, but now it's within my brain and my body, but now also is how we are changing and influencing each other in this process.
Yeah. I mean, you think about that when you're in a meeting or in a conversation, right? I mean, we're talking to each other and there's only 3 of us.
Yeah.
But is my brain thinking and having the same images that Jerry's is when we're talking about the same words?
Right.
Probably not. Mm-hmm. And we have to talk a lot to get to some shared ideas and some shared mental models and language about things. But what a task that is, and how much fun that can be.
Yeah. Well, and it just, I mean, when we talk into kind of even connected back into our second episode as well, as, when we talked about small t trauma, of being raised in traumatic environments, however you want to define it, but the reality of living in environments that trauma is present or is always a threat to happen. And how, again, on one hand, it's a beautiful thing. And I think we've all could go through heartbreaking examples of what we've seen kids survive. Things that if you put me in their situation that they had to face when they were 3, I might not last a week just because of my biology and the overwhelming trauma that I know some of the kids, and then I know I also have worked with them as adults and parents as well who've recovered. And so we have this amazing adaptivity, even if we're being traumatized in some of those early relationships. But then again, that epigenetic adaptation and the homeostasis that we create with our environment, whether it's, again, short-term or long-term, the tragedy of that then I see as we take that epigenetics into other environments such as school or later on employment or relationships where that really struggles. And again, I think that we as a society have to recognize that piece of the equation is that, these kids or these adults' genetics have evolved an incredible amount of resiliency to their situation. And yet, again, that resiliency in that situation might come across as a behavioral problem, a mental illness, or other thing once you change that environment. I think, again, Puerto Rico, such in my mind, is here's all these people that were probably permanently housed, at least when they're standing in the front of their houses, they look like they had a house. The next day, they're homeless. And yet they're surviving, and most of them will probably be okay over time if we as a society respond correctly to them. But that's kind of the other side of the direction, is maybe people that were living in stability then have that trauma in their life, and just how when we look at so many of the issues that we face in psychology, social work, public health, we look back to those relationships and the environment, and they just become such an important part of this equation in a big way. And I wonder, just to shift in the time we have left, we have about 15, 20 minutes left. What about epigenetics and how we help people heal? So epigenetics is a big part. If you think about how, if we're raised in traumatic situations, high stress situations, I do want to throw, there's a great show called Through the Wormhole, which for a nerd like me, I love, because they talk about quantum physics and this, that, and the other. But there's an episode that you can stream on YouTube that I think everybody should watch. I don't get paid by Morgan Freeman or the Through the Wormhole folks, but Is Poverty Genetic? And I just think it's a really great way to further your learning on this. And if you work with people struggling with poverty, it's a really great one to throw that in there. They have a lot of cool graphics too.
We could have commercials on our...
Yeah, I know. But, hey, if I can plug Morgan Freeman's work, maybe he'll plug our podcast at some point, But let's think about that, and to throw the questions out to you, epigenetics oftentimes, again, causes things that we then identify as problems, but are really adaptive in many ways to their environment. What role does this tell us about how we help people heal from severe complex trauma?
One thing I was thinking while you were talking, Matt, is how impressed I am that you made it 4 episodes without saying the words quantum physics. I didn't think you'd make it 4 episodes, man.
Once you break that barrier, it's hard to pull it back in. So that's why I handed it off pretty quickly there.
I was thinking about the concepts of determinism and predeterminism, and the difference between the two, which is actually big.
Yes.
That determinism is the idea that things have causes. And predeterminism is you have bad genes, so you're done, like your life is set. And I think that kind of differentiation between how we hear people think and talk about the symptoms that we see is an important thing to be thinking about when we're leading groups and helping people to think differently about how to think about genetics, and how to think about things that seem to be relatively unmalleable, and that they can be. That when we talk about them as deterministic, we mean that they have causes, and that there are things that we can find that would cause changes. And that's actually a positive message, as opposed to predeterminism, which can be like, you're set and that's the way it's going to go, and I'm real sorry, but good luck to you.
Yeah.
And so that's certainly what I was thinking while you were talking of how do we help people to think in different ways about those things.
Absolutely.
And how do we create them in positive events that can help to change those things, and how do we understand that nurturing helps people.
Yeah.
And that rituals help people, and getting the right ones is we have a chance of causing some change. Absolutely.
Jerry, any thoughts?
Always. Always. I think about what Curt talks about, though I think about it a little different, but he talks about not being organized by the symptoms. And that when we say, does epigenetics cause poverty, I think that that's a big leap of saying that something causes it. But if I have a particular way in which I have been adapted to react to my environment, and then my environment reacts back to me, it increases the likelihood that I'm going to, in some ways, go down a particular pathway. And I think that we want to understand that people who've had certain experiences have expectations and have a way of responding to their environment that elicit certain responses from their environment that in some ways can be confirming. But it also opens up the possibility that if we cannot be organized by people's past learning history, using Curt's word, or symptoms, and really begin to look at them with compassion and understanding, and also begin to understand how their behavior in some ways worked in their environment, but not necessarily now, we have the ability to create a change in that developmental pathway.
Yeah.
So yes, things could be predetermined based on the pathway it's going, but they're not necessarily people's destiny if the environment, both themselves can change or the environment can change how it's responding to them. So I think that's why therapy and therapeutic interventions, not necessarily therapy, but therapeutic interventions, have such an opportunity to change people's lives.
Yeah.
And they change our lives. It's reciprocal. So, really going back to the beginning of my bright, shiny object is trauma doesn't necessarily have to determine. We can actually be transformed in a positive way by traumatic experience.
Yeah.
If we both have internal resources, but the availability of external resources. So that people who have struggled financially with housing, with mental illness, with cognitive deficits, may be more dependent on the external environment to help support them in their healing and growth and having a different kind of future than they had a past.
Yeah, and that's, when the epigenetic thing and my real fascination with the post-traumatic growth experience, that the potential, as you mentioned, Jerry, to really take that pain and suffering and to turn it into wisdom and strength. I just can't say post-traumatic growth enough. I love those words. We talk so much about disorder and illness and this, that, and the other. It's an opportunity for strength. And, with the work with the populations that I've worked with, whether I'm working with a child coming out of a traumatic home, a lot of times in residential, or working with foster care or school situation, or adults, some of which have experienced homelessness for years, one of the things that epigenetics has really taught me is, I think before I kind of got into that level of research, I was really focused, especially somebody trained as a therapist, about the support piece of growth. And it's a critical aspect, but I really talk about now that support and resources, that there's a mix of these variables, and it's going to be different, again, with Curt's, when we talk about the complexity, it's going to be different for each individual's experience to some way. We can standardize some things, but it's going to be unique. And, watching, especially working with folks providing homeless services has been because the environment is so, in many ways, even though it becomes people's normal to some extent, that high stress, always a risk of experiencing severe trauma in that environment. And what happens when we put these folks, called Housing First programs, we talked about it earlier, we give these folks a stable housing environment to live in. And while some people, because of epigenetics, will feel actually, and we see this with a small group, they feel safer sleeping out in the street and just storing their stuff in the apartment because their brain feels safer out there than in an enclosed, quiet space. Over time, and for the majority of people we get into these Housing First programs, we see their mental health improve, we see their substance use decline, we see their medical health improve, and it just really gets me thinking, as somebody who's also worked in childcare residential pieces, is how healthy is our environment that we put folks in. I've really also given a great appreciation for if somebody's having to survive in a shelter situation, and I love the shelter workers, so don't hear me wrong. They're a part of our system delivery that's important. But if you're struggling with where you're going to sleep that night because you don't always get in the shelter, where your food's going to come from, and then we as a society come in and say, hey, get off your lazy butt and go get a job. We're not even getting those really environmental basic needs met. And so one of the things that I've really been alerted to by this research is, boy, if we invest a little bit in getting people into a healthier, safer environment, then the support is that much more impactful for the majority of people. There's always the outliers, but it's that environmental things, whether we're talking about a young kid that we identify as struggling in school, or whether it's the person that's been living out on the street with an addiction for 20 years, that change in environment changes the genetic, how our genetics are expressed, and over time really allows us to change the structure of our brain and allows us to succeed in the employment environment and other pieces. So it's really, I think, just that equal thing to the support in my thinking now around post-traumatic growth.
I think that one of the things we know goes across all people is that we're social creatures.
Mm-hmm.
And when we feel seen, heard, valued,
yeah,
our biology works better when we're connected. And when people become isolated, marginalized, oppressed, there's certain things they have to do to adapt to those kinds of experiences. And so really, the study of trauma really is telling us we can make a big difference early on in people's lives about how to teach them how to be resilient rather than waiting for something negative to happen.
Yeah.
But how to have a society that really sees children as, in some ways, I was reading the other day about the Lakota tribe, how they saw the children as sacred beings.
Mm.
And so really everybody invested in these children, not just the parents or not just really the health of the tribe was really dependent on these sacred beings.
Yeah.
And we don't necessarily have that same model if you're not doing smart enough in school, if you're not rich enough, if you're not behaving the right way, if you're not doing it, you're really a damaged being and not a sacred being anymore.
Yeah.
So I think we have to begin to really challenge not just the people that show up in our shelters or the people who are showing up from with mental illness or people who are, but really how are we as a society taking what we're learning, and as we watch TV, it could be me tomorrow. How are we going to make our children more resilient to the potential stresses that they're going to face in the future? Yeah. That's the really outcome of this, and that we want to kind of begin to have a society that raises really resilient children to maximize our capacity to survive, not just individually, but as a species.
Yeah. Any last words, Curt?
No, I mean, how do you top that, right? I mean, what a great message to throw out there about building resilience, especially in, I'm sure this is true for any generation, and that it's really hard to predict the future. And one of the things that you can bet on is that we'll need resilience. And so generating that is a wonderful message to be able to end on, I think.
Absolutely. And the resiliency, I think a lot of times, again, as a nerd of history as well, I always love to study Sparta because they were such like this warrior tribe, and everything was about being warriors, and they actually enslaved other Greeks to do all the work so they could just fight. And a lot of times when we say resiliency,
I like that.
Yeah, when we say resiliency, we kind of think of the Spartans, right? And I think just to kind of end on a note too is the resiliency we're talking about a lot of times, instead of, putting kids in military school at age 3 and doing all these horrible things to them that the Spartans did to their kids, we build resiliency through being loved. We build resiliency through people caring about us and connecting with us and attuning with us over time. And so even like, well, we need to have these resiliency is about being loved and being cared about. And that resiliency, as I say, if the zombie apocalypse happens, don't come to my house, go down to the shelter, because those are the folks that are going to survive. So we have these folks, whether they're a 3-year-old kid or a 60-year-old person experiencing chronic homelessness, that there's that potential for resiliency in everybody, giving them a little love, giving them an environment that's safe, that they can start to heal in, and let's unlock their potential. And that's, to me, the exciting piece of all this research, is that if we change, as Curt gets me thinking more concrete in my life, we change some of those variables around them, these people are going to be some of the strongest in our society. And so I think that that's an amazing point, Jerry, to end on. And I want to thank everybody for your time. As always, you can find our show notes at the Trauma Informed Lens, all one words, though we might need to be the quantum mechanic lens after this. But we'll stay with the topic for at least another week or so.
Once you've taken the lid off of that can.
I know. I've been pretty regulated, but we'll stick with the Trauma Informed Lens. So you can find our show notes and the video version of the podcast at traumainformedlens.org. As always, we would love to see your comments. We're also trying to get a little on the new and noteworthy list on iTunes, not because it will make us rich and famous, because we want to get this information out to as wide as audience as possible. So if you can subscribe to us on iTunes, it would really help. If you like the podcast, those reviews really help us get the word out too. So I want to thank you, everybody, for your time. We will see you next week on the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Thank you, Curt and Jerry.